Welcome back to Modern Buddhist Practice. This is Dr. Jared Jones, and this series I am looking at interesting things about Buddhism that I found around the internet, and in the process I'm responding to common objections and diving into academic debates and popular debates about Buddhism, hopefully clearing up some misconceptions and also providing explanations of Buddhist things that are not too difficult to understand, but for some reason very commonly misunderstood when Buddhism is talked about in popular culture. So hopefully that'll be of some use to you, and perhaps even a bit entertaining. So without further ado, I chose the video that I selected today, where a gentleman is describing why he didn't choose Buddhism. And what I find so fascinating about this clip is the reason he didn't choose Buddhism, the thing that made him not choose Buddhism, is actually the primary reason that so many people choose Buddhism. Now, stay with me on this, because this will become clear as we go why this is such a fascinating and interesting take. He decided not to choose Buddhism, and other people decided to choose Buddhism, but both people are wrong. And this is quite difficult. He's deciding not to choose Buddhism for basically the same reason that a huge number of people, in particular I would say in the West, Western converts to Buddhism, are choosing Buddhism. So I find this so fascinating, and it's something that's really worth our attention. And I will circle back, hopefully, for those of you for whom this is going to all sound way too religious, I'll circle back and we'll conclude the conversation somewhere that will be much more amenable to a sort of secular stance. But what I'm going to do is present a classical religious Buddhist perspective on this, which at the end of the day will address the big problem that the upcoming video has identified. But unfortunately will cause huge problems on the other hand, potentially for those who don't like the religious side of Buddhist stuff. So without further ado, for the second time, why don't we get into it?
My problem with Buddhism was that although so much of what Buddha said made a lot of sense, at the end of the day, Buddha was a human being. And he had admitted this himself, right? He's just coming up with the best guess that he could, contemplating and thinking and whatever, it came from his own understanding, right? And so he came up with this, the eightfold enlightened path based upon certain principles that he came up with, things that he understood. And he claimed it, in a sense, it's almost like he was saying it's fitra. He says that anyone will understand this, right? But at the end of the day, I was trying to understand what is the purpose of life, why are we here, what's it all for, what's the reason for our existence. And although Buddha comes up with some answers, my real problem at the end of the day was still, well, how do you know? How do you really know, right? How can you be sure? My problem.
So he says, the Buddha said that he is simply a human being. He says the Buddha did his best to simply come up with some answers to these difficult questions that we might have. And now he is left in the position with, well, if the Buddha is just another human being like myself, if he's just another person with his own biases, historical context, and the epistemic limits, right, of ordinary human senses and so forth, then how does he know for sure the things that he is saying? How does he know for sure about these big questions that he has in life? And since this is from a Muslim channel, the big questions that he has in life, I'm assuming, are where does the universe come from? Where does the universe go? Where do we go after this life? Where did we come from? Those sorts of big questions that many who are drawn to the Abrahamic faiths would like to have answered. And I'm not going to address every single aspect of this because there are a lot of little aspects. let's dive back into the video. I'm going to just quickly say a few things about the points that I'm not going to address, and then I want to address the main points, the really big, juicy points that, again, are, on the one hand, the reason that so many people have accepted Buddhism in the West, because they think this is not part of Buddhism, but it is. And ironically, he has chosen to reject Buddhism for lacking this piece of stuff, but it is part of Buddhism. So let's dive back in. I'll briefly go through the points that I'm not going to cover in this video because, you know, they're interesting, but I can just say a bit about it and you can look it up yourself. And then we're going to go through this really juicy part, okay? So here we go one more time.
With Buddhism was that although so much of what Buddha said made a lot of sense, at the end of the day, Buddha was a human being. And he'd admitted this himself.
So point number one, the Buddha was just a human being, and that he admitted this himself. So that's point number one, and this is the biggest, juiciest point we need to bite into, because the implication is, as we get to the end of the video, one more time, you'll see, the implication is, well, if you're just a human being like everyone else, how do you know that we have been circling in samsara for countless lifetimes? How do you know that the Four Noble Truths will lead to the end of that if you're just a normal person like me sitting here? I don't see all those connections, right? So it's a very valid and important question. If the Buddha is an ordinary human being like everyone else, then who has this exact same epistemic limits in terms of what he can see and smell and taste and touch and so forth, he cannot know what it is he claims to know. And that's a big, big, big problem for Buddhism. Now, just very briefly, I promised I would do this at the end, but let me do it a little bit now. The Buddha does say, for example, in the Kalama Sutta, and I'm not going to pull this up, you can look it up yourself. The Kalama Sutta is very often seen to be sort of a radical skepticism manifesto, but that's not what it is. If you read that sutta in detail, he starts with a clan of people who don't believe in Buddhism. And they say a bunch of teachers have come by. What teacher do we rely on? And how do we know which teacher is reliable? And he points out to them that the other teachers who have come by have asked them to follow them based upon a number of criteria that they cannot assess from where they're sitting right now. And since they can't assess the validity of those criteria from where they're sitting right now, that's not a good method for deciding who to follow. Then the Buddha provides them with a method for assessing a teacher that they can access right now. What method for investigating a teacher can they assess right now? The stuff that's like immediately at hand for normal people. Sort of like he's about to say, you know, it's just stuff that anybody, if they looked around, would be able to understand about the world, and they would agree with. And because of this, at the end of that sutta, immediately the whole Kalama clan become students of the Buddha, and they take refuge in the Buddha and make a lifelong commitment to following his teachings. And by the way, they do that without any self-inquiry that is basically unguided. It's all guided by the Buddha. So this is obviously not a sutta about skepticism. Okay? All right. So first major point, he says the Buddha admits to the world that he is just an ordinary human being. That's not true. The Buddha doesn't say that, and I'm going to go through a number of sources from both the Pali canon and the Mahayana canons to show that that's not true.
Right? He's just coming up with the best guess that he could, contemplating and thinking and whatever it came from his own understanding, right? And so
next that he is thinking, guessing, contemplating, and just using his own normal human understanding, a bit like, let's say, a number of the Greek philosophers might have, or I don't want to include any other groups, but let's just say that. It's sort of like, well, he's just doing speculative philosophy. And how reliable is speculative philosophy when you're talking about, from an Abrahamic perspective, the ultimate destination of the essence of your being forever. And by the way, the stakes aren't any less serious in Buddhism, because in Buddhism, your mind stream, your mental continuum that carries your karma and so forth, has no beginning and it has no end. So if you don't get this right, if you don't make progress along the path and enter the stream and start heading towards actually getting out of samsara, there's the potential that you're going to be stuck, not forever, but for an extremely, extremely, extremely long period of time. And most of that will be extremely uncomfortable. So the stakes are very high, and he's right to point that out. However, as I'm about to show, and this is the other part of that big, juicy, meaty sort of issue we're going to cover, the Buddha does not simply say, well, I thought about it really hard and I made a few educated speculative guesses and arrived at these conclusions that I think are quite logical. That is not the Buddha's argument about why he thinks the Four Noble Truths are truths. And that is not how he claims for himself that he got the knowledge that he has. He claims that he knows this directly from his own experience, and there's much to be said about exactly what that means. So we'll circle back around to it, and that's what most of this video is going to be about.
He came up with this, the eightfold enlightened path based upon certain principles that he came up with, things that he understood. And he claimed it, in a sense, it's almost like he was saying it's fitra. He says that anyone will understand this, right? But at the end of the day...
Now, this is the other thing. You probably recall at the Buddha's enlightenment, again, minor point, but if you go to the suttas and sutras concerned with what happened immediately after the Buddha was enlightened, he sat there under the tree for 7 days, trying to decide whether or not he was going to teach what he had discovered. And the reason was that what he had realized, according to him, was so difficult, so beyond conventional understandings, so beyond what his culture accepted as, and the philosophers and the religions of his time accepted to be true, at least from his perspective, that probably it would just make people angry if he taught it, or if it didn't make them angry, they wouldn't understand, so it would be fruitless. And actually, it was Brahma. There's a sutta called Brahma's Request, where Brahma, who is seen to be the highest deity of the current universe, according to Buddhists, Brahma is the highest deity operating in the highest heaven in this universe, comes down to the Buddha and says, look again, look more closely. And what you'll see is that some people only have a little bit of dust in their eye. They just have a small bit of dust in their eye, and if you clear that away, they'll gain realizations immediately. So already we have the intervention at a very early stage, although there are several other interventions earlier, of a deity who is seen to be the very highest deity in the entire universe, coming down to the Buddha and humbly requesting that the Buddha teach what he has learned, and saying it won't be fruitless, it will be worthwhile to do this. So then when we get to this final point here...
I was trying to understand what is the purpose of life, why are we here, what's it all for, what's the reason for our existence. And although Buddha comes up with some answers, my real problem at the end of the day was still, well, how do you know? How do you really know, right? How can you be sure?
We get to this final point, how do you know, how can you be sure? And this is again part of this big, juicy, delicious subject we're going to cover today. How does he know for sure? Okay, very, very interesting subject. On the one hand, you could say the highest deity of the universe, the first deity who woke up when this universe first came into existence, the deity who, before he met the Buddha, thought he was the creator of the universe, according to Buddhism, right? So for those who have an Abrahamic leaning, this should start to sound a little bit close to home, that there was a deity who was the first deity of this universe. According to Buddhism, that deity simply thought and believed that he was the creator because there was nothing else but him and the universe. And then when he thought there should be some other beings, those beings appeared because of the karmic connection between him and those other beings and the power that he had due to his positive karma. Those beings appeared, and so on and so forth, until we end up with various types of religion on earth who also say that there is a final creator deity. And we'll get into that as the video goes. In any case, so this highest deity comes down and requests humbly at the feet of the Buddha, please teach these things to others. So that's one sort of authority, right? That's certainly one sort of authority, to say that the deity who regarded himself as the creator of everything told the Buddha, this is a good thing to teach. So if you have an Abrahamic leaning, and you have enough sort of creativity to think, well, there was one deity at the beginning of this universe, and that deity has some role in exactly the way that things came into existence, and that being's will had some influence on the way everything came into existence in this universe. You know, we're starting to get, obviously not exactly like Christianity, but we're starting to get something closer to a theological picture that some versions of theology could agree with, you know, like 80%. Not 100, obviously, but so many common features. That deity said, Buddha, you've gotten this right. Not only that, you need to teach it, and other people are going to understand it. That's number one. Again, I'm not going to cover that, which is why I'm discussing it now. Number two is that the Buddha knew for himself, actually. But part of the pattern for how Buddhas teach is that they don't teach until they receive a request. So I'm not specifically going to cover that sort of broader picture of the patterns that Buddhas, when they arise, fall into. I covered that very briefly when I was discussing Maitreya in the previous video, Buddha Maitreya. But if you look at Buddhist sources, there is this pattern that all Buddhas follow. Part of the pattern is that a Buddha should be requested to teach for their first teaching. Now, let's get into the really juicy bit. Is the Buddha just a human, and does the Buddha claim for himself that he's just a human? Did he arrive here in the same way that everyone else arrives here? Does he have the same epistemological limits as everyone else? Did he simply think all of this up on his own? And what are the limits of his knowledge? If it's not like a normal person, what are the limits of the Buddha's knowledge? And what do the Buddhist sources have to say about this? And therefore, at least following his reasoning, although I think he's missing one step in there, doesn't matter, at least following his reasoning, if we could show from the Buddhist sources that, at least from a Buddhist perspective, that the Buddha does have direct knowledge of these things, then the Buddha at least would be certain about this. He would know for himself. It wouldn't simply be speculation. So we're going to assess that right now. So, this is a sutta called With Dona. And Dona is a Brahmin, is a priest in the priestly class of the society in which Buddha was living. And he sees on the ground that there are footprints. And in the footprints, there's not just the impression of a foot, but there are spokes, 1,000 spokes, and a wheel with rims and hubs like a chariot wheel. And he's amazed. He thinks, you know, he's an educated person. He's a Brahmin, so he's studied the holy texts of his culture. He's done all the philosophical debates, and he goes, wow, whatever being is leaving these footprints with a chariot wheel inside with 1,000 spokes must be a really holy, incredible being. So he follows these footprints, and he sees the Buddha sitting in meditation underneath a tree. And when he sees him, he sees that he has this incredible demeanor, and he says, Master, are you a deva? And a deva is a word in Pali and Sanskrit that means God. Are you one of the beings from the heavenly realms? And he says, no, I'm not a god. And this is usually where the secular Western audience stops. They go, oh, said he's not a god. There it is. End of discussion. Right? Buddha's just a human like us. Okay, let's carry on reading. He says, are you a Gandhava? A Gandhava can mean one of two things. Either it means a being who is in between lives, so he's transmigrating from one life to the other, or it can mean a celestial musician. So there are musicians in the upper realms, and the Gandhavas are those musicians. And he says, no, I'm not a Gandhava. And then he says, well, are you a yaka? Oh, you can also say the word yaksha. That's how they say it in Sanskrit. Are you a yaksha? And yakshas are spirits that live on the earth. They're a particular type of spirit that lives on the earth. They can be good, they can be bad. Yakshas are of mixed character, like human beings. Quite often they live in undisturbed forest areas. And then he says, no, I'm not a yaksha. So there he is sitting at the foot of a tree. It's a natural question. Yakshas live near trees quite often. Are you one of those? No, I'm not. Well, how about this? Are you a human being? No, Brahman. I am not a human being. Wait a minute. I thought the Buddha admitted that he was a human being. No, he said, I'm not a human being. And then the Brahmin, the priest, recaps the whole situation. I said you were a deva. You said no. I said, are you a Gandhava, a being who plays music for the gods? No. I asked if you were a nature spirit. You said no. And I asked if you were a human being, and you said no. And yet, remember, he's followed these footsteps that are the types of footsteps you would expect from a holy being, with these incredible markings inside. And he says, I'm a being who has abandoned all of the causes that would cause someone to become a deva. I'm a being who's abandoned all of the causes that would cause you to become a musician for the gods, or a nature spirit, or a human being. And since they were abandoned by me and completely cut off, they're not going to develop in the future either. Instead, like a lotus, remember, a lotus is a flower that grows out of the water, and it grows in muddy areas, and it comes up out of the mud and the water. And because of the way the bud is shaped, the flower inside never gets any mud on the inside. So he's saying, I grew up out of the same world that you're in, but what I am is not a human being. And instead, you should know me as awakened. This word awakened is Buddha. So what are you? I'm Buddha. So Buddha is a separate category from human beings. I'm no longer a human being, although, I have been a human being in the past. But all of the things that make someone a human being have now been completely cut off, and I am Buddha. That's what I am now. Wow. Okay. So what does it mean to be a Buddha? What does it mean to be a Buddha? He's not a human being. Is this actually a remarkable difference, or is he just saying, you can call me an awakened person, but actually I really am a human? No. Not a human being. Brahman. Priest, I'm not a human being. I am Buddha. What is a Buddha? So again, this is where so many secular Buddhists can just fast forward to the next section. So this Sutra, TOH 95, okay? TOH 95. This sutra describes a huge history of what the Buddha did. This is the Play in Full Sutra, the Play in Full Sutra. This describes the whole past life history of the Buddha and how he got to the point where he became a Buddha. And not just a Buddha, but in particular, the particular type of Buddha that he is a Samyaksam Buddha, a unsurpassed, fully awakened Buddha. And a Samyaksam Buddha is a Buddha that cultivates over an extremely long period of time relationships with other beings, so that when they reach their final life, before Buddhahood, that they have prepared the conditions really precisely so that they can basically launch a new round of Buddhist teachings at a time and in a place where no Buddha has given teachings. So it's a very particular sort of set of causes and conditions that have to be accumulated for you to be that particular type of Buddha. Now, of course, all of us can attain enlightenment that has exactly the same qualities as this Buddha. That's true. But if we wanted to attain Buddhahood in exactly the same way, where there were no Buddha's teachings around, and we were going to reintroduce the Buddha's teachings to a new, basically a world that didn't have them anymore, we would have to go through a much longer process of setting up the conditions for that to be so. So what did he do? Well, for a very, very, very long time, he developed all of the perfections of character, cultivated all good qualities, and removed all negative qualities. In addition to this, over the course of billions of lifetimes, in billions of bodies, he took ordination and became a monk with 4 million different Buddhas and presented offerings to 5.5 million Buddhas. And similar, as a Bodhisattva, a being who is striving to become a Buddha, he met with solitary Buddhas. So those are, again, just a different class of Buddha who don't teach, basically. They attain enlightenment. They attain not enlightenment, but arhatship. They enter Nirvana, and they simply sit in meditation and inspire people. And so he became a servant or an attendant to 1,540 million or 1.54 billion solitary Buddhas. And then in addition to that, prior to entering his final life, he helped innumerable beings enter the paths, attain liberation, and so forth. Now, it says here, this is right before becoming Shakyamuni Buddha. With only one lifetime remaining before he would become Shakyamuni Buddha, he was abiding in the heaven called Heaven of Joy, Tushita. Okay, Tushita. And he had this name. My pronunciation of Sanskrit is terrible, even though I studied it at university, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it. And there, in Tushita, the gods there were showing him great reverence, honoring him. So the gods were prostrating themselves to him in Tushita. And they were so happy that very soon he would become a Buddha. And he would attain perfect, complete, unexcelled, meaning there is nothing better than this, awakening. Now, where was he hanging out while he was there? He had this incredible celestial palace, and you can read all of these details if you'd like. Unbelievable. The heavenly realm of Tushita is a splendor in every imaginable way. Humbly, I think it, in terms of the descriptions of Tushita and the pure realms and so forth, where Buddhas and Bodhisattvas dwell, I think this puts the beatific vision had by some Christian saints. It makes them look quite mild by comparison. Not to put them down, but it's just absolutely unbelievable, the type of circumstance he was living in. But even more importantly, millions upon millions of gods were there, turning their eyes to the palace, gazing at it with awe, because even the place that he lived was so incredible. And, much more importantly, great and vast Dharma was being proclaimed. So he's there not only living in this incredible environment, but all around him, constantly, there are teachings of truth. And through the force of this truth that he is proclaiming and teaching, and I'm assuming others in his retinue in Tushita are teaching and proclaiming, all these beings, all these gods are benefiting from the teachings. Their negative emotions are being reduced. Pride, conceit, arrogance, aggression, rage, anger, and even greater happiness and well-being and joy are being increased even in Tushita Heaven. So much like Dr. Ortland's talk in my first video in this series, there's infinite bliss and the bliss is increasing. Right? So the beatific vision of Tushita, of being in the presence of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva who is about to attain Buddhahood, is that same quality. as he described in the beatific vision. Infinite bliss with increase. Oh, goodness gracious. And so he's there teaching the Dharma, and there's a symphony of 84,000 musical instruments. And you can carry on reading this. You can read the beginning of this, and you can read to the end if you would like. But this is an extremely long, the play in full sutra is extremely long. You can see here, it talks about the whole story. The whole story of the Buddha. Okay? So, the Buddha was not just another person who had some ideas about philosophy he speculated about. He's a being who spent billions and millions, millions and millions and billions of lifetimes. Anyways, so he spent countless lifetimes cultivating this final realization of Buddhahood. And in his last life, even according to the Pali canon, which is where this sutta comes from, remember sutta means Pali canon, sutra means you're probably talking about Mahayana materials, and he says, actually, no Brahman, I'm not a human being. The conditions he prepared required a human rebirth for the attainment of Buddhahood, but the attainment of Buddhahood is not simply being a human being coming up with your own ideas. It is the culmination of a causal process that extends, in Shakyamuni's case at least, over billions of lifetimes. And so what is he if not a human being? A Buddha. Buddha, right? And Buddhas are not human beings. They're Buddhas. Okay, so that's fine. Let's say he's not a human being. He's some kind of, he's higher than the gods. He's higher than the nature spirits. He's higher than the musicians and attendants that hang out in the highest of heavenly realms. Like what is it in Catholicism? The cherubim who are playing the harps and things. He's higher than all of these beings. But does he really know what he's doing? And how does he know? And on what authority does he claim to know? Well, sorry, we're not quite there. In the Play in Full Sutra, just to piggyback on this idea one last time, then we'll go on to that next point. He says he's a Buddha. One of the things that he does, see we're in chapter 3 now, previously we were in chapter 2, one of the things that he does is they ask, he selects the time period, the family, the location of his rebirth very, very carefully, so that he's born into, again, you can read all the details here, but he's born into a family that has the right qualities so that he can carry out the various signs and wonders and other sort of patterns that should occur in the life of a samyaksam, fully enlightened, wheel-turning, as they would sometimes say, Buddha. Wheel-turning meaning in the past there was no Dharma in the world, and he sets the wheel of Dharma in motion. So now the wheel of teaching is turning again. Okay? So he wasn't just someone who was randomly born, found out that life is terrible, and then decided, well, maybe if I just stop desire, that'll help or something. He had already been training for millions of lifetimes with millions of Buddhas and millions of solitary Buddhas, and selected exactly where he wanted to be born, and went through exactly the process that is typical of all wheel-turning Buddhas. And there are somewhere between 7 and 28 ones that have occurred on this planet in prehistory, according to Buddhism. And if you read a little bit more widely, there are actually countless Buddhas that extend way beyond, right? Way beyond just the ones that appear on this planet. And as a matter of fact, if you do a little bit of math, if the Buddha himself trained with 4 million Buddhas and made offerings to 5.5 million Buddhas, that's a lot more than 7 or 28. So it wasn't all Buddhas on this planet. Okay? Okay. So the Play in Full Sutra. You can read this at your leisure. This is, again, from the Mahayana canon. Play in Full. Now, was he ordinary in terms of his activities on earth? Because I would have to pull up, I don't know, 70 different references to give you this information, I decided to just hop over to the Wikipedia page. You are welcome to follow up these references yourself. If you search any of these on 84000.com or Sutta Central or Access to Insight or dharmatalks.org, you will find the vast majority of these accounted for in a number of different places. So, what are the miracles the Buddha performed on earth in addition to this sort of more elaborate story that he told about his history before being born on earth? You following? So how is it that he showed on earth that he's not just an ordinary person? Okay, well, there's a lot of ways. He had a miraculous birth. So rather than being born through the typical means, he came out the side of his mother. He came out his mother's side. A bit like a cesarean section, but out of the side. And this happened naturally. He simply came out the side, and then he took 7 steps. And immediately after taking 7 steps, he spoke. And he said, "I'm the chief of the world." And in addition to that, every time he placed his feet down with each of the 7 steps, a flower bloomed, a lotus bloomed underneath his feet. So his birth was miraculous. Again, if you're following the Buddhist sources, for the secularists, we're not at the point where you should come back in yet, okay? All right. Let's carry on. I just realized it's terribly dark in here. Right. Hopefully that'll help a little bit. As you can see, this is a very high-tech and professional operation I'm running. So, during his youth, on the first occasion where the Buddha entered a deep state of meditation called jhana, the tree that he was sitting under, the shadow stood still so that his meditation wouldn't be disturbed. So this was during his youth. There are a number of other ones there. Let's jump forward. We're going to talk a lot about his psychic capabilities, so we don't need to address it here. Yeah. This is a really lovely one. The Angulimala story is one of the best stories in the entire Buddhist canon. It's unbelievably inspiring. It's a bit like, man, I really can't think of a parallel for this in any of the Abrahamic teachings. It's really incredible, really unique. I don't want to tell you the whole story, but I'll tell you a little bit, and then I'll tell you the miracle that was performed. So, Angulimala was the son of a royal minister, and he wasn't originally called Angulimala. Angulimala means necklace made of fingers. And the reason it's necklace made of fingers is that in the later part of his life, he became a serial killer and was collecting people's fingers and putting them on a necklace. And so he became known as Finger Necklace. You know, just like we have nicknames for serial killers now. I don't know, the Night Stalker, you know. He was Finger Necklace. If there'd be a Netflix special about him if it was happening today. Okay. So Angulimala, because a holy man had come to his father and said, Angulimala, your son is going to be a terrible murderer. He did everything he could, you know, with all of his influence and power as a royal minister, to ensure that his son grew up learning about ethics and values and training with the best teachers to develop good character. And he trained with the best martial arts instructor that they had at the time. and that was in the area. And through a long series of events, skipping over quite a bit, he did actually develop extraordinarily good character and wanted to help others, wanted to benefit others. And the other students, because he was such an extraordinary and strong martial artist, the other students that were training with him in that area turned the head instructor against him by telling them that this young man who would become Angulimala was planning to kill him and take over the school. And of course, the instructor didn't believe that, but they kept arranging these circumstances, and eventually they sort of framed Angulimala to put him in an awkward position with the teacher. So finally, the teacher goes to Angulimala and to try to get rid of him, and says, "You've learned everything that I have to teach. I only have one more lesson, but I won't tell you what it is until you agree to do whatever I tell you have to do in order to gain this final skill." And he says, "Okay, you're my beloved, trusted teacher." I'm paraphrasing, but I trust you and I'll do whatever you say. And the teacher says, "The final skill that I have is being able to raise the dead and heal people. And in order to gain that capability, you have to kill 1,000 people." And Angulimala, who had been trained since his earliest age to be absolutely harmless, perfectly ethical, deeply respectful to everyone, because his father was so horrified he would turn into a terrible, terrible monster, is horrified by this idea. But he's already made a solemn promise to his guru, and this is a very, very important relationship in those days. And so he is now in the position where he has to do this, he thinks. And so he begins by killing robbers and thieves and, basically criminals. And eventually he runs out of criminals. And because he's such an incredible martial artist and athlete, at the time they said he could chase down a horse. This is how incredible he was in terms of his athletic capability, that he could chase down a horse, Angulimala. So once he runs out of criminals, he's starting to sort of get a bit numb to this whole killing thing. And he's starting to think, once I have the power to raise the dead, it won't matter who I killed in the past, because I can just raise them all back to life. And so it will be as if I hadn't harmed anyone. And so then he starts killing innocent people. And if you are to take the story at face value, it says that he got to 999 people. He had one left. And around this time, the local king, who was controlling the military in this area, had everyone else who had tried to go after Angulimala had been killed. And so the king, the local people were giving him a hard time and saying, "You have to send somebody after Angulimala." And who's going to go? And so finally they get an army together, and they're all going to go and kill Angulimala. But of course, this is big news in the local area, and Angulimala's mother hears that there's an army going to kill her beloved son. And as you know from true crime documentaries in modern day, even when someone has done terrible things, often mother is always still at their side. Not that she believes that what he did was right or good, but it's mom, So mom heads out onto the road ahead of this army and heads to the area where Angulimala is thought to be residing. And the Buddha reaches out with his clairvoyant capabilities, and he sees that Angulimala's mother is walking towards where Angulimala is hiding. And he realizes that if Angulimala kills his mother, he's going to end up in hell for an unbelievable period of time, and there'll be no way to help Angulimala. And so the Buddha sets out, and with his clairvoyant capabilities, he's able to determine the exact right moment to appear on the road. As Angulimala sees his mother and starts to head towards her, he notices the Buddha and says, "Ah, good. I can kill this guy, this monk, instead of killing my own mother. That's better." as terrible as that is. Angulimala had reasoned, well, this is the last one. Once I kill this person, I can just raise them back to life, no problem. So if it's my own mother, why does it matter? But luckily the Buddha appears. And remember, Angulimala can chase down a horse. But the harder and faster he runs trying to chase down the Buddha walking at a leisurely pace, he can't catch up to the Buddha. And he's running as hard and fast as he can, he's yelling at the Buddha, and the Buddha is just walking. And Angulimala can't catch up. And finally, Angulimala is getting a bit tired, and he calls out and he says, "Stop!" And the Buddha says, "I have stopped." And Angulimala says, "What are you talking about? I'm running as fast as I can." Again, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm running as fast as I can, and you're walking, and I can't catch up to you. So clearly you haven't stopped. And he says, no, it's you who haven't stopped. I've attained the final goal. I've stopped, but you have not, right? And upon seeing these miraculous signs, Angulimala, who is wearing a necklace made of maybe 999 fingers, who was just about to kill his own beloved mother, throws down his sword, throws down his necklace, bows before the Buddha, and becomes his student. And in that one lifetime, according to the Buddhist sources, within that single lifetime, Angulimala attains Nirvana. He's able to overcome all of his negative deeds, even killing that many human beings in a single life, able to become an arhat, enter Nirvana. It's incredible. So, this was one of the miracles of the Buddha. For those who have a bit more of an Abrahamic leaning, I don't know why, but if any of you have seen The Chosen, this reminded me of The Chosen. One of the Buddha's future patrons, who extremely important patron for the Buddha. He bought the land for the Buddha's largest monastery at the time. At the time of the early Buddhist community, he bought the land so that they could build the first monastery and paid for the monastery there. So he was known by this nickname, Anthapindika, and the Buddha, the first time he met him, called him Sudatta, which was his real name. And nobody knew besides some close family members. Everyone else called him Anathapindika. And so he was shocked, right? Anyways, there are a bunch of moments like that in The Chosen, which is about the life of Jesus. Really wonderful series. There was another case where at the time of the Buddha, there were all of these other meditators from the local Vedic culture who were training in meditation. And in particular, there was a group of 6 great meditators who had all sorts of clairvoyant powers, and they could move objects with their mind. They could emanate fire from their mouths. They could create incredible aromas that would just fill the air. They could levitate. They could read people's minds. All these sorts of things. Again, according to the Buddhist sources. And the Buddha went to a gathering of these 6 teachers who were leading hundreds and hundreds of students, and he basically, it's a bit like when Abraham goes before Pharaoh. I really hope I'm not bungling my biblical history. Let me make sure. I really don't want to bungle the history here. Well, in any case, there's that great story in the Old Testament where the one of the Jewish prophets goes before the Pharaoh. I think it's Abraham, and the pharaohs they do their magic tricks, right? But then Abraham is able to do even greater miracles right in front of them, right? And so there's this theme in the Old Testament of the holy men of the tribe of Abraham always doing better miracles of the same kind of the same variety than those they are sort of encountering on the outside. And this is a very similar sort of idea. So the Buddha then displays these unbelievable magical powers. He levitates into the air and emits fire from the top of his body, but water from the bottom, and then reverses it, and water's coming out the top and fire's going out the bottom while he's giving a Dharma teaching. And then he emanates his body into a bunch of different places. So there's a bunch of him giving the teaching all at one time while floating in the air, and and while they're filling the air, his body is lying in different positions and lying down and walking and sitting. And so when the other religious leaders see the degree of incredible power that he has, they all run away. And then the students there become his students. Then there was another case where the Buddha is from the Shakya clan, and the Buddha saw with his clairvoyant power that a war was about to break out, and the subject of dispute was the Rohini River. And so as the two armies got to the edge of the water and they were about to start fighting, the Buddha levitated out over the river. And as he levitated above the river, he spoke to both sides and convinced them that human life is more valuable than water. And therefore they were able to reach a new agreement with regards to how to use the water. And by the way, these are examples from the Pali canon. This is not like some weird thing that the Mahayana people invented later and, oh yeah, the Pali canon is just all secular stuff. No, this is the Pali canon. This is the quote-unquote EBT, the early Buddhist tradition. So this is all right there in the earliest and quote-unquote best, most authoritative materials. Although when you look at the later, again, quote-unquote later materials, it's the same stuff. It's the same miracles. It's the same degree of power. It's the same types of stuff. Okay. He also showed power over nature. There was one of his cousins was trying to murder him. Gave a bunch of alcohol to an elephant that was known to be quite angry, let's say, quite wild, and released this elephant on the road just as the Buddha was coming down a particular road, and the elephant stops and doesn't harm him. And then furthermore, the Buddha uses his psychic capability to stop Ananda from being harmed by this elephant. He did miraculous healing. He put out a forest fire. And there are even more. There are many, many, many more. And this is Wikipedia, so obviously it's not exhaustive. Let's close that down. So now the question we finally get to is, obviously this is not an ordinary person according to the Buddhist sutras. So what we've done so far is we've said, okay, well, he said that he's not a human, right? He said that he himself is not a human being. He's a Buddha, and that Buddhas are not human. He said that from his own perspective, he has lived billions of lifetimes, countless, limitless lifetimes, and that in the more recent ones, even though lifetimes are beginningless, I didn't go into that source, but he does say there is no beginning to rebirth, that in the most recent lifetimes, that he trained with 4 million Buddhas and made offerings to 5.5 million Buddhas and acted as an attendant or a servant to 1.54 billion solitary realizer Buddhas or solitary realizer Arhats. So the amount of training that he's done, just in terms of being in the presence of other Buddhas, is absolutely mind-boggling. So this is not the claim of an ordinary person. And then he selected where he'd like to be reborn so that he could carry out a very specific life plan to make his life as beneficial as possible to other beings. Now, okay, all that's fine and well. Let's say all of that is true, just for the sake of argument. Now, his main contention at the end is, well, okay, maybe he's not just a human being, fine. Maybe he did have all these past lives, fine. Maybe it wasn't an ordinary person in terms of how he lived because of all the miraculous and incredible psychic and telekinetic powers and things that he had, fine. But does he actually have a wide enough scope of knowledge in terms of the broader system. Because remember, this gentleman's question was, I have the big questions of life. He didn't spell these out, but why are we here? Where did we come from? How did the universe come into being? Where's the universe going? What is the big meaning and purpose of my life? And these sorts of very large questions. The only person really, or the only being really, that is fully equipped to answer those questions is an all-knowing being. Only a being who sees every moving part of the system comprehensively can, for sure, without any doubt, without any error, without any mistake, a being who knows all of the stuff inside every being. He knows all the epistemological elements of reality, right? He knows the minds and karmas and causal interrelationships of all things, and then also knows all physical objects and the causal interrelationships between physical objects. Only a being who knows all that could comprehensively, definitively, without any possibility of error or mistake, answer these questions. Now, obviously, a speculative philosopher, as he sort of imagines Buddha to be, or a ancient psychologist, as many secular Buddhists today sort of reframe the Buddha, couldn't possibly answer those questions definitively. They could simply offer kind of like a cultural answer or a historical answer or a sort of philosophical speculative answer. So what does the Buddha claim about his own knowledge? Okay, here's the Sutta 4.24. I want to point out we are again in the Pali canon. We're in the Nikayas, okay, the Book of Fours. What does the Buddha say about his own knowledge? Bhikkhus, which means monks, in this world with its devas, which are the gods, maras, which are demons, brahmas, which are the highest of gods, and amongst the ascetics, which are the great meditators, amongst the brahmins, which are like the great philosophers and scholars. Once again, it's devas and humans. Whatever is seen, heard, sensed, cognized, reached, sought after, examined by the mind, that I know. In other words, all of the epistemological stuff, known, seen, heard, sensed, cognized, reached, sought after, examined by the mind, the contents of the internal life and experience of every single being, from the highest gods to the lowest demons, that I know, knows for himself. Not only this, in this world with its devas and so forth, he's again saying he knows it, but he's not subservient to it. So he's not bound by the system that he is observing. So he has knowledge of the whole system and the whole interaction of all beings, but he's not bound or stuck in the same way that everyone else is. Furthermore, he says, having seen what can be seen, the Buddha does not misconceive the seen, nor does he misconceive the unseen. Does not misconceive what can be seen. So things that aren't yet seen but could be seen. He doesn't misconceive these because he's already seen what can be seen. Does not misconceive the one who sees. So the beings who are doing the seeing, he also doesn't misconceive. Having heard directly what can be heard, he does not misconceive the heard, nor the unheard, nor what can be or could be potentially heard, nor those who do the hearing. So all objects that could become objects of experience, whether they are seen, or they are heard, or they are sensed, or they are cognized with the mind, the Buddha does not misconceive the objects of those, those objects that have not yet been cognized or known or seen or smelled or touched and so forth by sentient beings, or that could be cognized, because he's already seen all of those himself. Nor does he misunderstand, misconceive those who do all of that. In other words, the Buddha is omniscient. Not only this, what does the Buddha claim for himself? Thus, bhikkhus, my monks, whatever being ever stable among things seen, heard, sensed, cognized, the Tathagata is a stable one. So he says, in knowing all things, I am stable. This is the stable condition of my mind. And I say, there is no stable one more excellent or sublime than that stable one. In other words, there are no beings in existence who have greater knowledge and stability in that knowledge than myself. So this is just a stunning, stunning statement. So how does the Buddha know all of these things? He knows because he's seen all objects that have been seen by others. And he's seen all objects that have not been seen by others. He has known all things that others know, and he has known all things that others do not know. For himself, directly. So, once again, Pali canon, not Mahayana canon. When we go to the Mahayana canon, what does it say here? So this is TOH 1-6. You can look this up for yourself. Chapter 11. There is a teacher, a matchless man, born into the Shakya family. The Shakyan family is the Buddha's family. He possesses understanding, the translating buddhi here, of all dharmas. Dharmas just means all things that exist. Since this person who is born into the Shakya family, he's referring to himself, knows all things, therefore he's called Buddha. So beings who know everything are called awake. They're called Buddhas. Buddhas see the past. Likewise, they see the future. Likewise, they also see the present. So the Buddha doesn't only see what is occurring now, the Buddha sees all past things, all present things, and all future things. What does he say? The omniscient one knows everything that may be recognized, knows everything and sees everything. And this is why he's called awake. Those who can't know and see everything are asleep, right? A sleeping person doesn't see the rest of the world. The Buddha sees the rest of the world, which is why he's called Buddha, awake. Not only this, he's not just omniscient. He has recognized what is to be recognized, which here I believe is referring to the Four Noble Truths. He's meditated upon what is to be meditated upon and abandoned what is to be abandoned. Therefore, he is called Buddha. So Buddhas aren't simply omniscient. They have realized the most critical point, right, which is the Four Noble Truths and how to get out of this process of suffering, and ultimately also how to attain enlightenment. That's the key recognition, the key teaching, as we discussed in the Maitreya video yesterday. He has meditated on what needs to be meditated upon. Here, what he's referring to is cultivating all good qualities. If there is a good quality to be cultivated, if it can be cultivated, the Buddha has already perfected that quality and has abandoned what is to be abandoned. If there are any negative qualities that a being can have, whatever those negative qualities are, a Buddha has already fully abandoned those negative qualities. So a Buddha is perfectly good, perfectly omniscient, and has the greatest power of any being in reality. Now, at least from a Buddhist perspective, this is a being you can trust, right? If a being like this says, hey, here's my advice on what you should do. Here's what the meaning of life is. This is a trustworthy person, if all of this is true. Furthermore, This is TOH 127. Again, you can look this up on 84,000. This is a Mahayana Sutra. Here he is talking to a young man. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Sanskrit. And he says, "Young man, ask whatever question you may wish of the Tathagata." Tathagata is the Buddha. The Bhagavan is also the Buddha. These are just titles. "And I shall gratify you with answers to each and every question you have asked." And he says to the young man, "Young man, I am omniscient. I am all-seeing. I have attained preeminence because of my strengths and fearlessness concerning all dharmas." Dharmas here meaning everything that exists. "I possess the unobscured wisdom of liberation." Young man, there is nothing in the endless, infinite worlds that the Tathagata does not know, has not seen, has not heard, has not understood, has not directly perceived, and about which he has not become completely enlightened. Now, how could you say it any more definitively than this? There is nothing in the endless infinite worlds that the Tathagata, the Buddha, does not know, has not seen, has not heard, has not understood, has not directly perceived, not speculated, not guessed, and about which he has not become completely enlightened. In other words, not only does he see and know all of these things, but he understands them. He understands and has wisdom about all of the most relevant and important aspects of these things. That's what this is claiming. Furthermore, if we go to TOH 95, this is the Play in Full Sutra again, right? We're now on chapter 26, so we've come quite a long way. Under the 10 powers, what is it? The 10 powers of the Buddha. He says, from the power of knowledge stemming from his divine eye. The divine eye is one of the ways that they talk about the omniscient mind of the Buddha, the clairvoyant powers of the Buddha, that sees clearly all forms without exception. Therefore, he is one with the power of knowledge stemming from his divine eye that clearly sees all forms without exception. So the Buddha sees all physical things. And if you look at the other powers, he knows all previous situations. He knows all contemplations, liberations, concentrations, absorptions, all ways of stopping negative emotions. He has this huge knowledge about methods to help other sentient beings. He knows every path that leads to every destination. He knows all the inclinations of all infinite beings. He knows how beings enter into different types of rebirth. He knows the capacities of each sentient being and how much diligence they have in applying the instructions. He knows the causes and results of all actions of all sentient beings that have occurred in the past, are occurring in the present, and to the degree that they can be known, because karma has a causal element to it, things that are occurring in the future. So the Buddha, in brief, knows all mental things, all physical things, and all things which in Buddhism we would call non-associated compositional factors, a number of things that are neither mental nor physical, or have elements of both. The Buddha knows all things. Okay? Can't say it any more clearly than this, I hope. Okay, so yeah, this is not a person who's just guessing. He's not just guessing, right? So another reason that you might find the Buddha trustworthy, if you have a bit more of a, let's say a supernatural leaning, that you think that this world is not all there is, that there's at least one higher realm, there's at least one heavenly realm, there's at least one great God. If we go back to the Pali canon, you can read this article. This is on Access to Insight. It's one of the free, widely available resources that teaches Theravada Buddhism. And there's this wonderful article written by Susan Jutla, and it's an article called Teacher of the Devas. Remember, Devas means gods. And Brahmas are the highest of gods. And among the Brahmas, there's one highest Brahma. The Buddha, throughout the course of his career, according to the Theravada canon, okay, again, not the Mahayana, the Mahayana canon says the same thing, but according to the Pali canon, the Buddha taught deities. He taught numerous deities throughout the course of his career. He taught Devas and Brahmas. Devas and Brahmas also at various points in his past lives and at various points in his career also did things to benefit the Buddha. And he brought benefit in terms of liberating humans and Devas and Brahmas. So even in the Pali canon, where it's supposed to be like totally secular and he's just like a psychologist and some guy who figured out some wisdom for us human beings, there are all of these gods appearing constantly to get teachings from the Buddha. Furthermore, if we flip over here to the Play in Full Sutra again, where it's describing the Buddha's life, there was one occasion where the Buddha was taking a little rest, and he says, "Monks, last night, as I rested here, comfortable and free from afflictions, and dwelling evenly with one pointed concentration, a group of gods arrived before me. With great miraculous powers and brilliant colors, they were pristine, blazing with magnificence, illuminating Jeta's Grove." And Jeta's Grove is the monastery that Anthapindika, the Buddha's student where he knew his private name, Jeta's Grove is the monastery that Anthapindika had built for the Buddha. Illuminating Jeta's Grove with their splendor, they joyfully approached me. There were millions of gods, including all of these who are mentioned here. No need to mention them all. They prostrated at my feet, circumambulated me, and gathered here before me. They joined their palms in respect and offered me this request. Remember, common theme in the Buddha's life is that to give teachings, Buddhas have to be requested. The gods said to the Buddha, "To benefit all the worlds, this vast sutra, this great discourse was taught by all the victorious ones of times past. Today as well, O sage, since you have dispelled attachment, consider the assembly of Bodhisattvas, defeat opponents, and tame all demons. By teaching us this supreme great vehicle, thus, able one, please grant us your lucid explanations." The assembly of gods thus offered their request, and with my silence I indicated my consent. This brought them joy and satisfaction, and with delight they scattered flower petals. Thus listen here, monks, to this vast sutra, taught in times past by all the thus gone ones. Thus gone is Tathagata. By all the thus gone ones, for the welfare of all the worlds. Listen one and all to this great discourse. And then we start getting into, let me tell you about the entire story of how it is that I became a Buddha and everything that's happened up until now. Right? And all of the gods said, "As you know very well, Buddha, all of the other Buddhas, they give this play in full teaching, this teaching about the entire way that they came into existence. And we request humbly that you also give that teaching for the benefit of the beings who are studying under you here in this life." So this is how this sutra from the Mahayana canon that I've been referencing came into existence, according to the sources themselves. So, is a being to whom even the gods turn. even the gods turn to say, please give teachings, who even the highest God comes to and says, please give teachings. Is this someone you can trust to give you reliable advice? If you accept all of those things, I would say, absolutely. Now, of course, if you didn't believe any of that, then why, you wouldn't. But this is so far from the secular characterization. Again, on the one hand, that secular characterization is what converts so many people to Buddhism in the West. But on the other hand, it is the thing that stopped this Muslim gentleman, or caused this Muslim gentleman to reject Buddhism. And yet here it is. All of the problems that he said, because of these things, I decided not to join Buddhism, are all right here. Okay, let's do a couple more things just because they're fun. So this is from the Pali canon, and this is just to show you. So great Brahma, great Brahma, Maha Brahma. So this is the great God, the highest God in the Buddhist worldview. This is the first God that woke up in this universe. When this universe came into being, this God woke up first and thought, wow, I'm eternal. I'm the creator. And then he created other beings and he went, I'm the father of these beings. And so there was this extremely powerful, glorious, beautiful God who had incredible power, was the first one to wake up in his own heavenly realm, who then began a process through his karmic connection with other beings of bringing other beings into existence. Okay? So after some time, the Buddha has now taught, right? And Brahma came down, requested the Buddha to teach. The Buddha's been teaching a while. One of the students of the Buddha in his Sangha of monks had this thought: where do these four great elements, the earth property, liquid property, fire property, wind property, cease without a trace? In other words, at the end of time, when the universe goes out of existence, where does all the physical stuff making up the universe go? And he says, okay, what I'm going to do is this is a great meditator, this monk, and so he's going to emanate himself. He's going to send a part of his being to these different heavenly realms, and he's going to ask the gods, can you tell me what happened? You've been around for a while, dear gods. Can you tell me where what happens to all the physical stuff at the end of this universe? And so first he goes to the four great kings, and they say, we don't know. Sorry. You gotta go to someone else. Maybe the devas, maybe the gods in the heavenly realm of the 33, maybe they know. And so he goes to the heavenly realm of the 33, and they say, sorry, we don't know. But maybe Saka, one of the rulers of the devas of the desire realm, right? So Saka is the, if I'm remembering correctly, and sometimes these are a little bit different in each text. There's a couple different ways you can arrange the upper realms, but Saka, I think, is in the Pali canon regarded as the highest god of the desire realm gods. So you have the desire realm, the form realm, which is a little bit more subtle in terms of physical substance, but there's still physical objects. And then the formless realm, where there are no physical objects, is pure consciousness. So in the desire realm, where it's a bit coarser in terms of physical stuff, the very highest of those beings is Saka. He is the ruler of the gods that are in this coarser physical universe of the desire realm. Brahma is here. He's the highest deity of the form realm. And then there are the beings of pure consciousness, but they're just sort of hanging out, blissing out. And according to some of the Mahayana sutras, the Buddha can also interact with those beings, but it's quite limited because they don't have bodies and they're like super absorbed in the bliss they're getting from being in a state with no body. And so they don't do very much. But these deities in the form and formless realm, they do a lot, and they interact with us here in the world. So they have these kinds of conversations with the beings, us lowly human beings. Okay, so he goes to Saka. Saka says, sorry, I can't help. He goes to some of the Yamadevas. They can't help. He goes to a number of others. He goes to some of the Tushita Devas, which is, again, unable to get help, he goes to another part of Tushita. He goes to all of these places, all of these upper realms, and he's able to get no advice from anyone that's of any use. And so finally, he goes to Brahma's heaven. He goes to the highest heaven. And we could say angels, right, there, the devas who are Brahma's retinue, his retinue, the sort of the heavenly beings, the angelic beings that he brought into existence in the early part of this universe are there, and they say, sorry, we don't know where this physical stuff goes. But Brahma, of course, great Brahma, the conqueror, the unconquered, the all-seeing, the all-powerful, the sovereign Lord, the maker, the creator, the chief, the appointer and ruler, the father of all that have been and shall be. Well, he is higher and more sublime than we. He should know where all of this physical stuff goes at the end of the universe, where it ceases without a trace. So, finally, Brahma appears, and he asks Brahma in front of Brahma's retinue, and Brahma's retinue is really locked in now. They're going, okay, this is a question we hadn't thought to ask. Brahma was here at the very beginning of the universe, and through his will and our connection with him in terms of karma, we came into existence in this universe. He has to know, right? He's the wisest being we know, besides the Buddha, of course. And so the monk asks, Great Brahma, where does everything go? And Great Brahma says, Monk, I am Brahma, Great Brahma, the conqueror, unconquered, all-seeing, all-powerful, sovereign Lord, the maker, the creator, the chief, the appointer, the ruler, the father of all that have been and shall be. And the monk, humbly says, Friend, I didn't ask if you were the great Brahma, unconquered, all-seeing. What I asked was, where does all this physical stuff go? And a second time, in front of, Brahma's big audience there in heaven, he says, I'm the all-powerful, the all-seeing, the father of all that have been and shall be. And the third time, the monk says, Friend, dear Brahma, great Brahma, I didn't ask if you were the creator of all and powerful, and what I asked was, where do the elements go? And finally, Brahma just takes him aside. He's leading him off by the arm to one side and says, Listen, my people here, they think that I know everything. They think I know everything that will happen in the future. They think I'm all-knowing. But actually, there are things of which I'm unaware. There are things I haven't realized. And he says, I don't know what happens at the end of the universe. But the Blessed One, the Buddha, he knows. You need to go back. You need to go back to the Blessed One, and he can answer your question for you. And so he does go to the Blessed One, and the Buddha answers his question by saying that the physical universe, it dissolves into a very subtle form of consciousness. And this is another interesting point. The type of consciousness that he describes is a term in Pali that only appears in one place in the Pali canon. But when you turn to the Mahayana sources and the Tantras, the description is much more elaborate. That what it says there is that the subtlest unit of reality is a union of a very subtle physical substance and a very subtle type of consciousness. And that union, that monism, what we would call in philosophy a neutral monism, of the very subtlest physical substance and very subtlest type of consciousness, is the sort of fundamental unit out of which the rest of reality arises. And so, at least here in the Pali Canon, the Buddha just says there is a type of consciousness into which these coarser types of matter eventually dissolve. And so all of this coarse physical matter you see in this universe will eventually dissolve back into what he calls consciousness without surface. There's another translation, I don't know if I have it here. No, But on Sutta Central, so this is Dharma Talks. On Sutta Central, there's another translation of this term. But in any case, it's an interesting little point. So the Buddha provides that answer. This is not to say that the universe is mind only, but it is to say that at the end of a physical universe, the stuff that's making it up dissolves back into consciousness without surface, which is not defined in the Pali canon. But in later sources, although they're not using this term, the way this is described is that the subtlest unit of reality is clear light, rigpa, is this union of subtle physical substance and awareness, and that is what everything dissolves into. Okay, now for a little fun after all that. So, occasionally new gods are born into Brahma's heaven. Occasionally there are young devas and young Brahmas that are born into Brahma's heaven. And so here, on the invitation of divinity, there's a young Brahma, Baka Brahma, who challenges the Buddha. And he thinks, this Buddha is not really that exceptional, right? Not really that, he's okay, but... And so he thinks he's being clever, and he says, Buddha, why don't you come up to the Brahma realms? Let's hang out. You haven't been here for a while. And the Buddha says, okay, I'll come. And so he goes up to the Brahma realms, and then he says, you know what? While you're here, why don't we have a competition? Why don't we have a competition of psychic power, and we'll see who's better. We'll see who's stronger. So, let me see. Yeah, here we are. So he's going to have this competition, and he says there's a number of other things, but let me just do a few because these are pretty funny. So first they say, well, let's see who can see more realms. And this young Brahma, he reaches out with his mind and he starts describing some of the realms that he can see. And the Buddha says, yes, I can see those also, but there are 3 realms that you can't see. And then he names those 3. So he says, not only am I equal in knowledge to you, but I'm superior. I can see further. And then there's a realm named after God's right. And then they're looking at, well, what do you know in terms of... I'm sorry, I should have read this a little bit more closely before I began, but I think in this section they're saying now, oh well, what of all of these sort of objects that make up stuff? Can you see the sort of physical atoms that are making things up, and the creatures that are there, and the gods, and then the higher gods, and blah 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 blah? And the Buddha says, yes, I can see all those. And there's a really interesting thing that happens. There's a really interesting thing that happens where he says, is this down below? My apologies. So then he says, well, why don't we have a little competition to see who has the power to disappear from the other. In other words, can you go somewhere that I can't see? And so Baka Brahma tries to disappear, and he can't disappear. He can't go anywhere the Buddha can't see. And then the Buddha goes somewhere, and he can't, and the Buddha can't be seen, but he recites a verse. And so the Deva can hear him reciting the verse, but he can't see him anywhere. There's another section here, but there are also ascetics and Brahmins. I don't want to find it now because I don't want to take too much time, and we're near the end. But there's another section here where the Buddha says, maybe I can find it this way. Oh. You pass. Oh, right. Okay, yeah. So it was here. My apologies. So this was another really interesting point where they said, well, let's see who can look further into past lives. And the Buddha says, do you remember, Brahma, what you, young Brahma, do you remember what you were in a past life? And he says, no. And he says, before this, you passed away from a realm where it was called gods of streaming radiance. And then you were reborn in a place called universal beauty. And then you were reborn in a place called abundant fruit. So the Buddha says, I'm not only not your equal, let alone your inferior, I know more than you. I can see what you've been in previous rebirths that you've completely forgotten. Okay. Anyway, so this is a hopefully, if you were to think, is the original argument compelling? Did the Buddha simply say, "I'm a man. I'm just a guy who thought up some stuff based upon, whatever anybody else could have simply just looked at and analyzed, and therefore you should trust me and believe me, and if you do, you'll go to nirvana." Is that how the Buddha set up his argument? Right? Is that what the Buddhist sources claim of the Buddha? To put it at least in sort of somewhat neutral terms, although not entirely neutral terms. In other words, what are the Buddhist sources, primary sources, actually claiming about the Buddha? And whether we're talking about Mahayana sources or we're talking about Theravada, Pali sources, the sort of early Buddhist texts, which I think is a bit of a mischaracterization versus some of the later ones. Both sources are painting the Buddha as some type of omniscient being, as having extraordinary psychic capabilities or miraculous powers that he displays on multiple occasions throughout his life, starting from his birth, that he describes in both canons that he was a bodhisattva for numerous lifetimes, and that he deliberately chose this family, this period of time in history, to be reborn into in order to have his last life as a bodhisattva before becoming a Buddha, and that upon becoming a Buddha, he's not a human being. So he doesn't have an ordinary birth, he doesn't have an ordinary history, he has an omniscient mind. Not only that, he has absolutely perfect knowledge of everything and the interrelationships of everything, past, present, and future. In addition to this, even the highest gods don't know what he knows, and constantly other gods are appearing before him. Or not other gods, excuse me. Constantly, regularly at least, gods are appearing to him and asking him for advice, asking him for guidance, or asking him to give teachings. So this is not just another person giving his opinion on what the world is about from a Buddhist perspective, a religious Buddhist perspective. The Buddha is an absolutely astonishing, singular being. And the incredible thing about the Buddha is that he's saying, what I have attained is something that anyone could attain if they do the work that I did. And not only that, as we progress eventually through sort of Buddhist history, if you will, looking at the different ways of framing up Buddhist practice and the goals of Buddhism to finally get to his original thing, which is, what is the meaning of life? What are we supposed to do? Now that we know, at least from a Buddhist perspective, if we're taking that perspective seriously, now that we know the Buddha is reliable, entirely certain and reliable from his own perspective, that he has the authority to speak to these issues, what does he say, having looked at the whole system of consciousness, of reality, of things that are a blend of consciousness and physical reality? What does the Buddha say we should do? And he says there are two goals, maybe actually three goals, but those really boil down into two. One goal is to attain nirvana, to just get out of this involuntary process of rebirth, because you've been in it forever, and it is possible to get out. So that's option number one. Option number two, which is an extension of option number one, is to become a solitary realizer Buddha. Solitary realizer Buddhas are, you'll recall, he did act as a servant to 1.54 billion solitary Buddhas during his time as a Bodhisattva, a person striving for enlightenment. Solitary realizers train in the presence of a Buddha. While they're in the presence of a Buddha, they make a determination to take their final rebirth before entering nirvana, in a time and place where no one has heard of the Buddha's teachings. And so solitary realizers then get reborn in a solitary place. They're sometimes called, it's like a rhinoceros's horn. There's just one pinnacle of virtue sticking out of the forehead of those cultures that they're born into. So they're solitary like a rhinoceros horn. Also, some texts say, well, rhinoceroses wander around alone. And so they're solitary like a rhinoceros wandering around alone. So, solitary realizers, they don't teach other than simply attaining nirvana and then sitting in meditation near people who will be inspired by the fact that there's this person who's attained this incredible mental state, but they don't give any teachings. They just inspire people through their presence. And then finally, option number three is to become a fully enlightened Buddha, which is to become someone who has utterly perfected their character, accumulated all good qualities, and utterly purified their character, removing all negative qualities. Perfect purification, perfect accumulation of good qualities, including omniscience, including unbelievable power to do all sorts of things. I didn't go into all of the things that Buddhas can do. I focused on miraculous things that the historical Buddha is said to have done, but if you read the wider description of what Buddhas do, even according to the Pali canon, Buddhas are capable of creating entire worlds through their mental power, through their clairvoyant power. They can create entire worlds that people can be born into, entire pure realms that people can be born into. And as demonstrated in the story where the Buddha appears to all of those non-Buddhist teachers and shows all these miraculous powers, and he appears with dozens of bodies in the sky. According to the primary sources, at least in the Mahayana canon, that's not a one-off event. The Buddha is actually capable of emanating hundreds of thousands, millions, billions, trillions, actually an infinite number of physical forms and physical bodies that can appear and act and behave and interact with others exactly according to their needs to benefit them in exactly the right way. That's what a Buddha is, and does all of this solely for the benefit of others. So creates whole universe systems, whole worlds, whole realms, bodies, forms, events, experiences that will slowly pull people along towards liberation and enlightenment. This is what Buddhas do. This is the extent of their power. And they do this with perfect knowledge of what is knowable. In other words, omniscience. So is that, if you took that seriously, is this someone you can trust? How do you know? How do you know, Buddha, that this is the right way to go? Well, if you take what Buddhists are saying seriously, the Buddha knows. The Buddha definitely knows. He knows what's meaningful in life. And these are the three things. If you read some sources, they call these, that when they boil it down into two, they'll call it the two definite goodnesses. All other goodnesses are temporary. Rebirth in a heavenly realm is temporary. Rebirth as a wealthy person with a nice family and a beautiful body and good health and so forth in the human realm is temporary. Even we were talking yesterday about the prophecy of Maitreya. Eventually, the human lifespan on this planet, it should go up to 80,000 years as a top number. And it should be perfectly prosperous. Virtually no disease. People are at peace. There's a global government that's perfectly meeting people's needs and perfectly ethical. Right? Sounds a bit too good to be true, but if we take that seriously, still temporary. And the Buddha describes it as temporary. It's like there's a period of history that's like this, and then it changes and slowly degenerates. And then there are these big cycles where things get better and worse, right? Which is part of the broader cosmology that, if you go all the way back to the first video, Dr. Ortland said, Buddhists aren't supposed to ask about metaphysical questions and cosmology. My goodness, what have we been talking about today? There are these huge cycles of time, according to Buddhism and according to the Buddha, where these massive global events occur in these cyclical patterns, where the Buddha comes into existence, gives teachings. Those teachings go on for some time, and then they go out of existence. And then there are long periods where there are no teachings, and there's a lot of suffering, and things get worse and worse, and then it slowly gets better again, and then bang, a new Buddha. The time is right. The connections have been made through various emanations of the Buddha and so forth over a long period, and then bang, a new Buddha can arise. No cosmology, right? No metaphysics, right? Okay, so what else? What is the meaning of life then? According to this being who is, according to Buddhism, omniscient, as powerful as any being can be, in other words, all-powerful. Whatever can be done, the Buddha can do it, as long as it's not out of alignment with the good, because he's perfected his character and removed all negative aspects from his character. That being says there are two definite goodnesses, Nirvana and Enlightenment. You can escape the cycle, and that's perfect for you. And then, if you continue on with your training, then you can attain Buddhahood, and that's perfect for others. That's your meaning. That's your purpose. That's what you should be striving after, according to the Buddha. And in the meantime, we don't need to ignore this world. Because if you're trying to achieve Nirvana, and you're trying to achieve enlightenment, you have to do good also. You have to accumulate virtue. Ethics and character development involves interacting with the world and benefiting the world. So this is not a system in which you simply abandon the world. If you're on the Theravada path, the recommendation from the great Theravadan practitioners is that you strive for Nirvana, and if you can achieve Nirvana in a single lifetime, then you teach others, you benefit others as much as you can out of love, out of compassion, before you enter into final Nirvana, and then you'll be inaccessible. But you benefit others. So first you benefit others by not harming them, because you're just pursuing Nirvana. then you benefit others by actually helping them, right? So that's one way to go. Another way to go, if you're going for full enlightenment, is that you benefit others a great deal, as much as you can, starting from wherever you are, right? You got to start where you are, benefit others, accumulate good karma, accumulate connections with others that are virtuous, that from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime you can continue building upon these relationships. It's just incredible. It's just incredible. You know, heaven is other people. Heaven is other people. And if that's too much, no problem. Go back to the Kalama Sutra. Grab onto what you can grab onto. If you think there's no karma, no rebirth, no problem. As a matter of fact, if you think there's a deity that wants you to, like Knights of Columbus, that wants you to do charity and to benefit others and to be selfless with your time and resources, or as selfless as you can, and to be, to treat your parents with respect and your grandparents with respect, and to raise your children well with good morals and values as best you can, and to be humble. My goodness. And not only that, to cultivate one of the most critical elements, love. To cultivate love, compassion, mercy, to whatever degree you can. If you think that, no problem. No problem. If you do those things, you are indeed, as Zakir Naik said yesterday, you are indeed headed up to the upper realms. If you're pursuing good character, purifying your negative character, interacting with others with as much good elements of your good character as you can, generous spirit, kind spirit, compassionate spirit, no problem. And if you think you're doing that because there's one universal creator deity, okay. Brahma is a student of the Buddha. If you go to Brahma's heaven, there was a near-death experience I heard, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, and I got a really good laugh out of it. I'll share it with you, maybe as a parting note. Before I do, just to wrap this up for the secularists, if you read the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha says when you're assessing teachers, just grab onto what you can, just start with what you can. And he says, look, you already know that when you're angry, your life isn't as good, right? And you already know that when you have love and kindness and stuff in your heart, your life is better. So you know that I'm right about at least that much. And then the Kalama clan says, okay, no problem, we take refuge in you, we'll follow whatever you say, right? So not quite a sutta about skepticism, but if it turns out that there is no karma, no rebirth, and so forth, and you have a really nice life because you cultivated love and compassion and got rid of negative qualities and trained in meditation and tried to be ethical, great. You had a nice life, you benefited the world a bit. Pascal's wager, Jones's wager. If it turns out all of this is real, well, now you did all of that and you accumulated the connections and so forth to do it again. Now, of course, if you know through reason, through experience in meditation, through the examples of senior meditators and so forth in your community that actually quite likely that all of this really is true, well, then there's more you can do. There are things you can do that are counterintuitive if you don't believe in karma and rebirth. There are things you can add on to what you would do if you were simply being secular about all this. And that's important to say. Mandala offerings maybe don't make very much sense, or doing 100,000 prostrations maybe doesn't make that much sense. There are some things you probably wouldn't do with the same intensity or vigor if you didn't think there were reasons to do so, let's say. Right, so there was a near-death experience I heard a couple of years ago now, and this young woman, I believe she was a young woman at the time, she passed away Might have been a car accident, if I'm remembering correctly. I was listening to a lot of near-death experiences at the time, so some of the details in this part are rough. I can't remember exactly what it was that caused her to pass away. It might have been a car accident, or it might have been a brain infection, but that's not so important. In any case, she passes away. She's clinically dead, to the best of my recollection. And Jesus appears to her. And she goes to heaven with Jesus. She follows Jesus up to heaven. And, you know, she's just awestruck, as you would be, in the presence of, you know, probably any sort of holy looking being. If you had just died and some incredibly holy looking being emitting light and so forth appeared to you, you would be in shock. And he said, I want you to sit and look at this tree. She said, okay, of course, you know, this is Jesus. I'm in heaven. He's telling me to look at a tree. I'm going to look at the tree. And she starts looking at the tree. And again, just to bring in some Buddhism here, she said that she could concentrate like she could never concentrate in her life. So from a Buddhist perspective, this is like jhana, right? In the upper realms, much easier to generate really profound states of concentration. And you need those states of concentration to do the types of profound spiritual work that we talk about in Buddhism. So she generates this profound state of concentration looking at this tree in the heavenly realms. And she realizes that her body, the tree's roots and so forth, and the ground and the air and the tree and everything else in that heavenly realm are completely interconnected. And they can't be pulled apart without losing the whole system. In other words, Jesus tells her to look at a tree, and she realizes interdependence. Prasita Samappada. She realizes one of the most fundamental Buddhist truths. And through realizing interdependence, she realizes that the only logical response to reality is love. That since we can't pull everything apart, since I can't pull myself apart from you, the only thing that makes sense is having a deep concern for how it turns out for you, in the same way I have a deep concern for how it turns out for me. I should be concerned about your happiness. I should be concerned about your suffering. And at least insofar as I remember, she brings this insight to Jesus, and Jesus says, yes, that's what I wanted you to learn. So I say all this to say, you know, if it turns out that, you know, Allah and Yahweh and the triune God of Christianity, that these represent actual deities who have actual heavenly realms, there's some possibility that those heavenly realms have deities who are already students of the Buddha, which means there's some potential there, that maybe some people entering those heavens will learn a version of the Buddha Dharma that's appropriate for them in that circumstance. So, you know, there's more of heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy, right? Not sure, but I find these things fascinating. So those of you who are religious Buddhists and you go, oh yeah, but you know, wrong views and you know, there's so many things they're doing that aren't right. Okay, you know. On the other hand, if they go to the upper realms, and it turns out that according to the things we read today, that millions of deities are worshipping the Buddha, millions of the highest gods operating in the heavens are students of the Buddha. What do you think it is that people are going to be learning there if they're interested in religion when they get to the heavenly realms? If they're interested in pursuing further transformations of their being, they're going to be learning Dharma. And apparently, according to some of the sources you read to say, thousands of deities not only know the Dharma, But they came to the Buddha, for example, and specifically requested, they said, hey, all of the past Buddhas that we've seen have given this teaching. Can you also give this teaching because it really helps people? Well, my goodness, if they already know, and they already know all these teachings, if you're interested in this, of course, you're going to learn these things, some of these things in the upper realms. So I don't think we should look too harshly at our friends who are aimed at heaven. Furthermore, and as a closing note, I hope to see you again soon. Okay.